Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and this show is called Farther Down the Rabbit Hole. Today I have the great good fortune to have with us again Professor Dr. Robert Ashford, who's going to be talking to us about binary economics, as well as a very, I don't know what you'd say, vigorous and thoughtful commenter on YouTube, as well as a poster. He's both a producer and somebody who stays very abreast of what's happening with other people's works and leaves comments on those works. So welcome, both of you.
Hello.
So I think what I'd like to start this off with is you've given me some charts. Robert, can I call you Robert on this, even though I know you're a professor?
That's excellent.
Okay. And some of these charts look a little scary, but I think what both Aaron and I want to know is, how do you do what you talked about last week? How can you put it into practice? And also, why are none of the political people talking about it? And we can use these charts whenever you want.
Okay.
Are you, by the way, on the stream?
I'm not on the stream. I can try to get on the stream if that helps.
If you want, because then you might be able to guide me better as I go through the charts.
Okay, now help me to get on the stream.
It's called rabbitholecentral.tv. And then you hit to the live stream.
Okay, I've got robertholecentral.tv.
Yeah, and then you'll get to the live stream, and what you should do is see a picture of your book. So I'll go to the book whenever you're talking, or Aaron's talking.
Well, it's slowly coming up, but I can actually start if you want while I'm.
Okay. Once it comes up, then hit to live stream. It's a picture of a little rabbit, an Egyptian rabbit, and
Okay.
that takes you on the live stream page.
I see an Egyptian rabbit there. I'm
Perfect.
gonna hit it.
Perfect.
Okay.
And then you
your
see.
picture?
Do you see the book Binary Economics?
Yes, I do.
Okay, and then I'll be flipping back and forth to the diagrams that you gave me.
Okay. Now that's good to start right there. That's a good place to start.
Okay, and I can come in closer on it too.
Okay, we'll do now.
How about that? Is that
You want to know the how? We're going to cover today the how, and we're going to cover the why don't people give it attention? Okay.
yes?
Those two, but to get there, I think I need to just for a few minutes at least recapitulate what was said before, and
Okay.
I'll try to do that real quickly.
Great.
Okay, and I'm going to try to appeal to your viewers and to Aaron and to you in a way that helps you see things in a new light. So I always start with this diagram, and I ask, is this two faces looking at each other by profile, or is this a vase? And the point, of course, is that you can see it either way, and it could be both. But if you could imagine showing this chart to a tribe of people who had never invented pottery, it would be hard for them to see the vase. Even the most educated person would see the two faces, and it might take a child or some imaginative person to see, well, actually, there could be a structure there, and that could even be a useful structure to hold water. So a part of the problem with binary economics and why it is not adopted and seen and recognized may be that people simply are taught to look at things in another way. And I would say preconceptions are a major problem with binary economics. Very few people concerned with helping the poor and the working people, or correcting social justice, or cleaning the environment, or who are concerned about anything socially important, come to the idea without preconceptions. That we all have preconceptions. And we all have a notion of what we think is best. And if what the other person's saying isn't meeting that, then there's an immediate rejection concept.
Right.
But we have to look at the idea from the point of view that there's another way. And there's always more than one way. And so that's what this starts with, just an idea that you see it in a different way. That doesn't mean it's the only way. Doesn't mean it's the most helpful way. It doesn't mean that other ways aren't legitimate. It just means there's another way. Okay, so that's chart one, and that's what it's intended to show.
Okay, great.
Now, the next thing that I would say is that we look at the relationship of capital and labor to production in a very preconceived way. And that grows out of Adam Smith. It carries through all the economists, even till today. So when I say capital and labor, let me start by a definition. We've got human beings that obviously do labor. They work. And then there's everything non-human. That some of those things that are non-human do work. That's what Adam Smith called capital. That's what Karl Marx called capital. That's what John Maynard Keynes, the economist who really represents largely the Democratic left-of-center party, called capital. So we have labor and capital. And both of those are used in production.
Hang on, I think Aaron has a comment.
I just wanted to ask, to be clear, are you, so like in Karl Marx's terminology, he would say the means of production. Are you saying that, could I say the means of production, meaning machines and hammers and nails or whatnot, are of capital?
Yes, excellent. Okay. And I would say it is the non-human means of production.
Okay.
Now, two other things, or two that are often called capital, are not capital in the sense we're talking about. One is money. Money is not capital. Money does not do work.
Okay.
It may facilitate the doing of work. For example, if I say, if you pay me next week, I'll paint your house.
Right.
Money will facilitate that work, but the money doesn't do the work. Now, another thing that people call capital is human capital. But that's really a confusion, because human capital, when it earns income, it earns by labor. So it's simply smarter labor or more trained labor. But when silver crosses the palm, you have to do some work. The great thing about the means of production capital is that if you own it and go to sleep, it still does work. And so where binary economists separate from Marx is that we do not agree that private property is theft. We believe that private property is what liberates people from working.
You think that was a proletarian sort of reaction to the massive amounts of capital that people of Marx's time were seeing, hoarded? Really, Andrew Carnegie pretty much built Pittsburgh, but people lived like slaves practically. Everything that they bought was sold to them by the guy who had just got done paying them.
Right. I would say that binary economics and those who believe in it are reacting to the same problems that Marx saw, but with a very different solution. So, and if you read the works of Kelso, he even wrote an article called Karl Marx the Almost Capitalist. and although he wrote in the 1950s, when there was a huge Red Scare, and he was trying to impress the most important capitalists of the time, he never disavowed Marx's objectives. So it's a very interesting historical note.
Say, Robert, could you turn down your computer so we don't get the echo sound?
Yes.
Thanks.
I will do that.
And Aaron, are you happy with that answer?
Yeah, I'm just trying to square away in my head the different terms that I might know for some of the things that Professor Ashford's talking about.
Okay, great.
I can kind of, put it into, square the terms away. Because some of the words that are used sometimes in these kind of discussions, if you don't know, aren't completely clear, about what, say, scarcity means, and it's, pretty tough to, move to the next information.
Right.
Well, Aaron, I thought that was a fabulous question, and so if the rest of your questions are as good as that one, we're probably going to make a lot of progress.
Excellent.
Yes.
Now, I want to go, now we talked about capital, and I want to say that the illusion that Adam Smith had, and that perpetuates to the present day, is that the most important thing that capital does is make labor more productive. That is an illusion, and it's an illusion that does a great deal of damage if your object is to help poor and working people. It is, on the one hand, it is something that glorifies labor. It makes you want to beat your breast and say rah rah, but it is not something that helps people earn a living in the way that we now produce goods and services. It actually is. If I were the owner of most of the capital and wanted to keep people confused, I would make sure that idea is held sacrosanct and particularly championed by the left wing. That would be my way to manipulate people. So I want to give you, the listener, just still recapping, a different concept of the relationship of capital, labor, and production. And to do that, I want to start off by saying Adam Smith looked at the Industrial Revolution this way. You saw 10 boards an hour with a handsaw, and 100 boards an hour with a machine saw, and the machine makes the person more productive. And that's the way he saw, even though he never really saw many machines. The steam engine was barely invented. He never really saw a factory.
I think he used hauling cotton or something like that as his example in Wealth of Nations, didn't he?
And making pins in a pin factory. But most of his work had to do with the specialization of labor and using very simple machines to turn out more per labor input. So he looked at the output of capital and labor in terms of the denominator, as it were, the divider of the person. So capital output per unit of input is the way he saw the role of capital. Capital makes labor more productive. There's no doubt about the fact that if you look at 1776, 1876, 1976, 2008 now we're at, that we have more output per unit of input. But the binary economists asked who or what is really doing the extra work. We do not believe it's increasing labor productivity. So let me give you another example. The example is the example of hauling that you mentioned. Let's suppose you haul a sack a mile and you're exhausted. It's a heavy sack. You put 10 sacks on a horse and go twice as far in half the time. Now, the binary economists would say the horse has done something very important beyond making you more productive. The horse is doing most of the extra work.
Right.
And if we had a private property system that gave horses property rights in their own work, the horse would never let his attorney say the role of capital is to make labor more productive.
That depends on whose attorney is.
Well, it wouldn't let him. Really, I mean, you'd never let the horse. The attorney representing the horse would never concede that.
Right.
And the point is that the horse is doing. Now, if you put 10,000 sacks on a truck to do 50,000 sack miles worth of work, and the truck driver is, sitting in an air-conditioned cab listening to music, he can hop out and go to a dance. Whereas, if you would imagine humans hauling that, they'd be exhausted. The truck is doing most of the extra work. So the binary economics says that it starts with a different conception. It is a fallacy to say that the most important role of capital is to make labor more productive. It's a self-deluding fallacy. It's simply false. It's not a question of whether it's good or bad. It's just false for important purposes. And that the real role of capital is to do ever more of the work. So now there is a reaction to this by some people. It says, well, it takes the person to lead the horse. And the binary economist says, yes, but the work of leading is not the work of hauling. So that instead of leading the horse, you led 10 slaves, let's say, Who would deny the work of the slaves? Just because the work of driving is not the work of hauling. The work of inventing capital, building it, installing it, maintaining it, operating it, repairing it, financing it, that's all fine work, but it's not the work of the capital. And so the binary economist starts by saying that the capital, you have to ask who or what's doing the extra work, and the binary economist says that capital is doing most of the work today. We could, if we were to be really imperialistic and enslave everybody but us, us the elite, and try to have an economy that produces everything we produce today, but only use Adam Smith's technology, couldn't do it. There's too many things that capital does that you never could do with labor. So once you understand that capital does work, then we have let's go to that second chart for a minute, if you want to do that. Now that's the example of the donkey or a horse. You've got on the first bar just a little bit of work done. One person hauling the sack, 100% labor. Then you've got the second chart where you've got the horse or the donkey, and it really can be. Yeah, you want to keep that small. You had it a good size, I think.
You want it there?
No, you want it small. It's okay.
Okay.
That's it. You see the second bar. Oh, you had it.
Just a second.
You had it before. It was the perfect size.
Right there?
That's okay. Good enough. That's good. Yeah, you see that one. So now that's the horse doing the donkey doing 95% of the work. You got 10 sacks going twice as far in half the time, and the labor input is decreased. And then if you go to the next one, you got to shrink down the size. It's so huge. So the binary economist sees capital doing most of the work. And if you were to examine everything that is done today and compare to how it was done 100 and 200 years ago, I think the conclusion would be the same, that more and more and more is done with capital and less labor is needed. The whole idea of inventing tools and machines is to shift work from labor to capital, to give us both increased output and more leisure. That's how we propelled ourselves from the stages when we had simple tools and no tools at all. So that's the process. And if you imagine capital being independently productive, then I would say that capital has 4 important real powers and then 2 important monetary powers, but 4 important real powers that people do not recognize. First of all, it replaces labor. So you get the same output, but you get leisure. Secondly, it's a misnomer to say that capital simply replaces labor. Anytime you use capital to do what labor was once doing, you get vastly more input. We can't compete with horses for hauling or computers for calculating or so many things. Capital always vastly increases productive power. And so it should, because that's what will liberate people. Third thing capital does is capital does work labor can never do. We talk about the growing economy. I love to tell people, Aaron, that a farmer never grew an apple.
Right.
All a farmer can do is help a tree grow an apple. We couldn't lift. We could have all the slaves in the world and not lift people in an elevator that we lift in an elevator routinely with electronic power.
Say, Robert. Before we leave this chart, I just want to make sure because I have some restrictions on how I can zoom in.
Yes.
On the far left, it says 100% labor because the person is lifting the sack.
Yes.
And then on the second one, it says 20 sack miles of work, 5% labor, and 95% of the donkey.
Yes.
So that means 95% is what you'd call capital, right?
Capital work.
Capital work. And then finally we get, on the last one to the right, we get 50,000 sack miles of work, less than 1% labor, more than 99% truck.
Yes.
So that's showing what Adam Smith couldn't even conceive of.
He didn't see that, no. And he barely saw a steam engine. We can't fault him. That's exactly right. And that goes on with everything. And then by the same token, when capital does work without labor. I always tell people, if you don't think capital does this work, try to live without your washing machine.
Right.
Capital does tons. So then, if you go down to the chart below it,
okay,
there's a second part of that chart. You'll see the top line shows the top of that line shows, if you can get the whole chart in, shows growth. You want to a little bit further to the left.
Yeah, let's see.
A little bit higher and shrink it. I'd zoom out a little if you can.
I only have 2 choices. That's the problem.
I see. Well, zoom out a little, you'll...
Oops, sorry. That's...
All right, that's good. I don't know people. I can see that. You see the top line shows economic growth. I mean, think
right
of,
here.
Like the left, 1770. Oh, I lost my... Oh, I have to... There you go. 1776, 18... Think of the growing economy. The labor portion, we're working not really harder than we worked before. Not really, not terribly much. In fact, some could argue we're working less. It's the capital instruments that are doing more and more of the work.
But would you say that on this, in terms of leisure as well, do you think some of the reasons why people have a diluted idea of economics is because even though we keep creating these machines that save labor, still people go to work for 8 hours anyway? It's like even though there's time-saving, energy-saving machines, that doesn't seem to matter one whit to the people that own them. You're going to go there and work just as long as you were before you had that.
Well, I think there's two different portions of why we don't see the leisure. There's two different aspects of why we don't see the leisure we should. One aspect is that we're not really fully employing, and that goes to the next lesson, we're not really fully employing the capacity, the capital capacity we have, and we're not employing it because that capital is concentrated. And secondly, since people are only allowed to participate in earnings, most people are only allowed to participate in earnings through wages and welfare, we have a make-work society where we're always trying to inflate work and confabulate work and make it seem more important and all of that. And people do have to work so much more because they're deprived of the ownership of capital. So both things are going on. People are denied leisure because they're denied ownership. As long as ownership remains concentrated, we will not fully employ our capacity, and we will not fully distribute leisure. Leisure is distributed through ownership, and that's why we don't have it.
So how would a factory worker, if I'm not jumping too far ahead here, how would a factory worker who makes, I don't know, makes toys, works in a toy factory, how would that person move from being someone that, makes the toys all day to owning capital?
Okay, well, that you are jumping, and I hope it can. I know we need to get to that, but I think there's just a couple of things one needs to understand first,
all right.
and that's the goal to get there. If you can go to the third chart, that's the chart, and zoom out. This is just going to make the point in the same way, and then.
Okay, this says total growth on this side.
Now, but we need both of those things. That chart there is how the conventional economist sees, in essence, the relationship of capital and labor to production.
Let me read it, Robert, for those who don't know. It says total growth over here on the left axis. And then here it says technological advance over time on the bottom axis.
Yes.
And this says 70% labor productivity, the bottom triangle, and then the top is 30% capital productivity. So it looks like at the beginning they were pretty similar.
Well, there was always this, this ratio, but it started very small, but the ratio seems to seem constant if you look at our society. Over the last 20, 30, 40 years, if you look at how much people are paid in wages, and you look at how much capital owners earn, wages claim about 70% of production. It's maybe down to 60-some% now. It seems to be dropping. And capital earns about. So that's the conception. Capital is making labor more productive. You see what I'm saying?
So that's what people think. But you're going to challenge this chart?
And the challenge is on the bottom.
Okay.
The bottom chart, which says what's really happening is that now we've got the productivity part in that little band. Labor productivity, labor productiveness, we called it. The work done by labor is pretty constant. We're not really working much harder than before, but capital is doing far, far, far more of the work.
I see. So this is
so
capital
that's a different
down here.
conception.
Okay.
Now, and it's just a different conception, but all I would ask the listener or the viewer to do is, based on movies and things, we've seen movies about the Revolutionary War and all that, based on just the movies you see and all the different things, the difference between driving a truck today and driving a covered wagon, the difference between copying 100 years ago and pressing a photocopy machine. Just all the different tasks. Ask how much of it is labor and how much of it is capital, and I think people begin to realize that we're continually squeezing labor out of production. Now, and if we can just concede that that's true in some sense, then we get to the third point, and the next point is the one point I'll finish before I can begin answering Aaron's very important question. The next point really has to do with a concept that economists tend not to talk about, and I call it unutilized productive capacity. I know that Aaron and Harold Channer had a little bit of talk about unutilized productive capacity. Now, I don't have a chart on this one, but I simply ask people to think, if they could sort of be the king and queen of the world today, and your object was to feed and clothe and shelter the world and give people the resources to make them deliver themselves to the highest good. If you had that goal, you were a good queen or good king. My question would be to every viewer, would it be easier on a per capita basis, per person basis, to do it now compared to 100 or 200 years ago? We might not be able to succeed today, but I think when most people think about it, that the technology to produce food, clothing, shelter, transportation, basic communications, basic medicine, not the highfalutin stuff, but the basic medicine, it would seem to me most people would say, well, we have the technology today. We don't use it, but we have the technology today to feed and clothe and shelter the world. I mean, a good example is food. 150 years ago, it took about 70% of the people to grow food for the rest of us. Now it takes about 3 or 4% of the people. Not in every country, but certainly in America. So that's clearly you could feed more people. In fact, we have surpluses of food. We pay people not to grow. So we have this unused capacity. And then stretch the example a little further. I say, suppose you're still king or queen of the universe today, the world today. You can do anything you want to. But instead of wanting to feed and clothe and shelter the world, you have a perverse desire. You love unutilized productive capacity. So you swing into Flint, Michigan, and you see a plant in mothballs. And you see people sitting around unemployed. You say, not enough. I want more plants in Flint, Michigan. Each one state-of-the-art, each one bigger than the one before, all in mothballs, and I want to see more people laid off. My guess is you could probably do that more today, easier today than you could 100 years ago. We needed people more to work 100 years ago. Now we're laying them off like crazy, squeezing jobs out.
Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to have to stay tuned for part 2 to find out how the king or the queen of the world could make things run more efficiently, and Professor Ashford will join us. Hi, this is Paula Gloria, and we're back again with Professor Robert Ashford, who's taking a break from Syracuse University this Sunday afternoon. We're streaming live on rabbitholecentral.tv, and we also have with us Aaron, who's known on YouTube as Blastingcaps. So carry on, gentlemen. I know we weren't able to finish in the last episode.
We're at a big point now. So I would say that we not only have unused capacity today, but we have the capacity to make more unused capacity, and we don't use it. We don't use. Now, most people, when they think of unused capacity, they think of people who are unemployed and would love to work. That's a very humane thing to do. But the truth of the matter is that most people who are unemployed and who would like to work more, through their labor power, there's not much that they can do that more people can pay for. I mean, I think there are a lot of people who are unemployed who probably can paint wonderful pictures and write beautiful plays and make great music and all of that, but gosh, the market's so saturated. The bigger unemployment we have is through capital.
Did you say amen, Aaron?
Feed, clothes, people we don't use.
I didn't mean amen in the sense that that's a good thing. I meant amen in the sense that he's absolutely 100% correct about that.
Right.
So the problem with unused capacity is the problem of the distribution of income. And the problem of the distribution of income, most people see, is solvable by jobs and welfare. Whereas the binary economist says the problem of the distribution of income is that capital ownership is concentrated. See, in a real economy, production is income. Production and income are the same things. If I produce widgets, but I can only eat so many, and you produce widgets, and you can only eat so many, I produce some, you produce some, then we trade. But we're both producers.
Right.
As capital produces more and more of the work, not only does it produce more and more, do more and more of the work, it produces more and more of the income. And so how do we solve that problem? Now, here I'm going to give you now a principle. And it's a simple mathematical principle, and it's not beyond most of the viewers. People don't have to glaze over when you talk about some simple math. I'm going to give you a principle that Adam Smith didn't see, that Karl Marx didn't see, and that John Maynard Keynes, the economist who guides the sort of the left of center, the Obama Clinton sort of side of the politics.
Right.
The promise of broader ownership in the future will more fully employ existing capacity and provide monetary incentives to build more capacity in the present. Now that's worth sort of really pausing about, because Adam Smith didn't see that, and John Maynard, and they were both brilliant people. John Maynard Keynes and Karl Marx didn't see that. So if we were talking about an idea that three giants didn't see, it's worth pausing and say, let's really think about that. The promise of broader ownership in time two will create the incentive to invest more in capital and employ more labor in time one. So it's a time one, time two situation. You're looking at the present and the future. You're looking at it together in one box, and you're looking at the relationship. Now here's the principle of economics that is not controversial, even among the standard economists. The demand for capital goods in the present, that is to say, to build a machine in the present, depends upon anticipated demand for what it can produce in the future. When you're building a tool, it cannot be used to produce something. But when you're done building it, it can be used to produce something for the future. Mm-hmm. So the present demand for capital today depends upon the promise of more ownership, more consumption in the future. And broader ownership in the future will enable people to have a demand for food, clothing, shelter, which can be met by more fully employing capacity in the present.
Can I make that a little more simple? You're saying if you're going to produce something, you want to make sure that in the future somebody can use it?
Yes, if it can afford it.
Can afford it, can buy it.
It can afford it, and they can afford it by there's only three ways you can afford something. You can either afford something by labor, you can afford something by redistribution, welfare, or you can afford something by owning.
I see.
And the one that's missing here in people's understanding is that is that capital can buy itself on the promise of its future income.
And you're saying that you have to factor that in, because if you look at how the future is unfolding, since capital is going to be more productive,
that's right,
it's going to be impossible to produce things for a market who is going to grow increasingly less capable of achieving what you're producing, of buying it.
Brilliant. That's exactly right. We cannot, when we're continually shifting production from the human to the non-human, you cannot satisfy the demand problem, the future, the consumption problem, the demand for goods and services simply through wages and welfare. You've got to include capital acquisition.
Okay, so now we've got a chart, and you're going to show us how?
Well, I am going to do that, but allow me for one more thing. I'm a lawyer, I'm a law teacher, and I'm going to get people to focus on a right they've never heard about.
Oh, okay.
But a right that has been in play for the whole 20th century.
Wow.
It's one of those things. You know, one of the things a lawyer understands is that when you try to find out what the opposition is not talking about, because what they're not talking about, the chances are that's what they're hiding, and that's where the real value is. I'm going to mention the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Okay.
Not with the earnings of labor, but with the earnings of capital. And I think in Aaron, because he's a very bright man and a very well-read man, I would say that when you think about the 20th century, it was a struggle regarding the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital that really defined the Cold War. The right wing, when some people in England were saying better dead than red, they were saying, oh no, better dead than red, because they were defending the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital.
Right.
And Communism was all about extinguishing the right to acquire capital with the earnings of capital. Binary economics is all about universalizing the right to acquire capital with the earnings and letting everybody participate. Because when everybody participates, that's the only way we can employ our existing capacity and create the incentives for more capacity.
Will the people that, have a majority of the capital now, will they have to relinquish, some of what they've amassed over time? For example, someone who has $44 million, are they going to have to come up off some of that cash?
I think I would say no. And one of the wonderful things, that's a beautiful question, one of the wonderful things about binary economics is it doesn't require anybody to give up anything. But it does require opening the doors of capital acquisition so everybody can play the game. If you could.
Why are they so afraid of that?
Well, that's a great question. I think, first of all, let's see its power. I would say if you read my book on binary economics, The New Paradigm, there's a chapter in there that talks about the broad beneficial implications of it. And we talk about the fact that one of the things binary economics promises to do is to create a new political dynamic. And we look at it this way. The rich really have two different portions. There's one group in the rich, and maybe they're the minority of the rich, but they're certainly not powerless. They would say, and some of them do, if you can make everybody become a capitalist and have greater distribution and more respect for private property and open the system to everybody, that's holy and that's wonderful. God bless you. Let's do it. But there hasn't been many of them. Maybe part of it is the barriers, but then there's another group that says, you don't understand. The wonderful thing about capitalism is it's so few of us. And even though we might begin even earning more of a bigger pie, we don't want to cut other people into it. We like the idea that most people cannot acquire capital with the earnings of capital because that keeps labor wages low, it keeps people to their knees. So what if we have to have some of our apples? We own the trees. We can have the apples taxed. So what? So there's a group on each side of that, but right now, the ones that say that maybe there's a better way, maybe they haven't all seen it yet. But my point would be that you can enable poor people to acquire capital with the earnings of capital without taking anything from the rich, and that's one of the potent aspects.
It makes you wonder about some of these guys, some of these philanthropists, as they like to call themselves, that have massive amounts of money, but and they maybe make some foundation or for some charity or something, and people slap them on the back and tell them how great they are. and this is an actual answer to something. This actually is a solution that no one will even talk about very much. So it's kind of ironic.
Well, the highest form of charity, a guy named Maimonides, an old philosopher in the old ancient times, said the highest form of charity is ending the need for charity.
Right.
I would say that a part of the problem here is that this is an idea that some people that people just don't see, and that's the good side of it. I think you can make the case that one of the reasons binary economics has been suppressed is that some people do fully see it and don't want it.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that this idea is not without its power or not without its appeal to both the left and the right once people come to understand it.
Well, Robert, that's why I'm so excited about YouTube, because I think this is the kind of work I'm trying to do, is to put this into people's imagination, because you don't see it, not even with Ron Paul.
Well, I wouldn't be having this conversation right now with you, Mr. Ashford, and Paula, if it wasn't for YouTube. That's how I met you, Paula. So
right.
That's proof right there.
In a way, those people who are either on the left or I want to say on the humane side or on the faith-oriented, those people who sincerely want to help poor and working people, if one can have a breakthrough with their perception, that would be that's a major point.
Right.
See, but the left wing also is full of, just as the right has the generous capitalist that would be willing to cut people in if they only understood the idea,
Right.
and the greedy capitalist that wants it all.
Right.
Just as there's both groups, and there's also a group on the left, and there's two groups on the left. One group affirmatively believes in redistribution. They say it is good to take the apples from the rich and give them to the poor, or it's even better to have state ownership of the apple trees. That's good. And if you're against that, you're greedy, or you're power hungry, or you're an elitist. If you're for private property, it's theft. I mean, there's those people who think it is an affirmative virtue to distribute the earnings of capital and labor by way of wages and welfare, and to depress earnings, capital earnings, as much as possible. I would say that plays right into the hands of the right of the rich, but that's my opinion. And most of those left wingers that say that, many of them have prominence, and they're the ones that get quoted on the media and all that. And so, and if you look at their net worth, it seems to be closer to the rich on the right than it is to the poor on the left that they're speaking for.
So this is as much of an information war as anything.
I think it's entirely an information war myself.
Yes.
I think once it's understood, the whole dynamics of the world will change. And remember, we're talking about an idea that Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes didn't see. Between Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes, you have the whole political structure of the world.
Right.
And so maybe it's simply ignorance. Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not just greed or self-interest or fear. Maybe it's just ignorance. I'm with you.
Yes.
And you are, Aaron. Let me say, I can tell when someone is picking up on it, and you are picking up on it. And you can be a teacher. This is not more complicated than 8th grade algebra.
Right.
Anybody can learn this. That's the truth of the matter. Let's see if we can take it a step further now, and see if we can get more people to understand it. Now, this is a chart, and this shows something called, this is something that Louis Kelso created. He's not known for this as much as he should be credited, but this is called the Employee Stock Ownership Plan. And if you can sort of shrink it down just a little bit more so we can get all three boxes in, but maybe we need those two right now. That would be, Let's start with the...
That's my only choice.
Okay. Well, let's get the two in.
Okay.
Let's get the two boxes in on top.
Okay, this is called box 3 of the general theory diagram.
Yeah. Okay. Now, let's get the two boxes on top. Lower it a little bit. Bring it down. Can you bring it down?
Oh, down?
Yeah, okay. Now, box 1 is a corporation that has a plan to invest more. That's what that is. That's a corporation that has a plan to invest. It wants to, so that the box on the top is the growth. Time 1, it's not there, and time 2, it builds a new plant, new equipment, whatever it is. That's growth.
Can I just read it for people? That's planned growth, and then that grid on the top is capital assets, and then underneath it says corporation or company?
Yes.
That's number 1, box number 1.
Right.
And then
you notice that it shows cash going out, and capital assets coming in. The corporation is buying.
I see.
That's what it does. And so imagine General Motors, for example, thinking that there will be enough demand to build a new plant, and so it builds a new plant or renovates, or imagine any company that's building new facilities, investing in something new. It doesn't have to be physical. It can be investing in patents or trademarks.
So you guys who understand these charts know that means that when the little arrow is going out, it means the corporation is spending its cash to buy assets where the capital assets come in.
That's right.
Okay.
And that goes on all the time.
Okay.
Now, it's interesting that corporations have two things at once. They both have unused capacity, but some of that capacity is becoming technologically superseded, and some of that capacity is wearing out, and some of that capacity is just a cushion. Companies need to maintain market share. So if suddenly the demand for some product goes up, if you're at 100% capacity and your competitor has got a little bit of a cushion, that competitor is going to grab up the new demand. If there's suddenly hula hoops become a craze or something becomes a craze, and you can make them. So companies always have both unused capacity, but they're also growing. And that shows a company with a plan to grow.
I see.
Now, there are three ways that companies typically can grow today. They can either use retained earnings, that is to say, the earnings from the last period, revenues minus expenses and taxes gives you earnings. The earnings you can either distribute as dividends to the shareholders or retain them. Most companies retain most of their earnings. And almost all of the hatchbacks there, about 70% of the new investment is paid for with retained earnings.
Okay, so you have the retained earnings so that you can grow, right, in the
That's
future?
Right, so you can make more investment.
Okay.
Now notice that when a company invests retained earnings to build more of the box, you've got a bigger box owned by the same shareholders. You haven't increased the shareholders.
Right.
The shareholders own a bigger machine, a share of a bigger machine, a bigger capital, but they're the same shareholders.
Uh-huh.
That, by the way, is acquiring capital with the earnings of capital.
Uh-huh.
And that's almost all capital in America is acquired with the earnings of capital. Very little capital is acquired with the earnings of labor.
So you mean that they're using their shares in the capital of the company?
They're using the share of their income to invest in more capital.
I see.
That's what rich do.
Okay, so instead of distributing out. Now, my way of understanding is if you need to raise more, using their shares in the capital of the company.
They're using the share of their income to invest in more capital.
I see.
That's what rich do.
Okay, so instead of distributing it out. Now, my way of understanding is if you need to raise more capital, then you cut in more shareholders.
Not necessary.
So you would dilute the company.
Not necessary. You can simply use the earnings. That's one way.
I don't see that in this chart, though.
No, you don't. No, I'm describing something that is not in the chart.
Okay.
The shareholders, the existing shareholders, are not shown in this chart. But you can imagine another line underneath the cash line, which has to do, or maybe it'd be a tube or something, which shows the ownership of this corporation, the existing shareholders.
Okay.
Now, and if you use retained earnings, it's building a bigger company owned by the same people.
Okay.
The second way you can pay for this is to borrow money from a lender. The lender could loan the corporation money, and the corporation could then invest in the equipment. The new equipment, once it's built, would earn an income, and that income would be used to repay the lender. This is not shown in the chart. Again, you'd have growth paid for with borrowed money, and the same old owners would own the new ownership.
I see. Okay.
More acquiring capital with the earnings of capital. The third way a company can pay for this hatched box is to sell new shares. And you might say, well, that'll bring in new people. But if you examine the distribution of wealth in our country, in most countries, here's a rough statistic for you. 1% of the people own 50% of the shares, 10% own 90%, and that leaves 90% scrambling for the rest, and most people owning nothing and having a negative net worth.
So what you're saying is
more shares.
So what you're saying is there's not a market to sell more shares because people don't have the money to buy.
Well, most people don't, and the people that do are already owners.
Right.
So even with the sale of stock,
right,
you're still basically acquiring capital with the earnings of capital, because that 1% that own 50%, they're generally not doing. They're earning capital with the earnings of capital private in their own personal estates.
Right. Okay.
There are some people that are. I mean, there's a number of well-paid people paying $100,000, $250,000, $400,000, $500,000. There are people who break the capital barrier. There's no doubt about it, and they do it with their labor. But they're statistically insignificant. If we depended on medicine saving people in the same way, most people would be dead.
Right.
Now,
right.
This shows, but this shows the possibility of setting up a trust where the owners could be. This is number box 2. Could be employees of the company, and the loan going to the trust instead of to the company. The trust taking cash, buying stock in the company. The company would issue stock. You see the new stock going that way. As the company makes its investment in the hatched box, and that begins now, after it's been built, begins earning an income, the company pays dividends to the trust. The trust repays the lender.
What are dividends? Pro-tax payments?
Dividends, no, the taxed
Okay.
on the corporate level.
Okay. And then the cash that comes back out of constituency trust
Pays back the lender.
is the cash that comes back, that cash that they're getting from their pre-tax payments?
Those are dividends.
They're dividends.
You could say pre-tax payments, you could call them pre-tax dividends.
Okay.
And then the dividends are used to repay the lender. And after the loan is repaid, this trust, which now owns a share in the company, is going to continue to get a share of the company earnings.
Right.
So it will then begin distributing income to the employees.
So this is what you mean by buying something on the future earnings of capital?
Yes, that's right.
I see.
And now, so this process shows how you can use what's in the law called a third-party contract, third-party beneficiary contract, to enable a company to acquire an asset, but for the benefit of an employee who's acquiring a share in the company. After it's paid for, then the employees begin getting an income. This is just a very simple model. This is not the overall binary solution. This is just a very simple model.
Right.
And there's an article on ssrn.com called Binary Economics, the Theory Behind ESOPs, that explains how this basic simple model can be transformed into what we call a super ESOP, which is limited not only to employees of companies, but consumers of companies, neighbors who live by companies, and even the whole population of people.
So,
all Americans now who own little or nothing.
So now before we leave this chart, the last one, the constituency trust can also take a loan from the lender, number box 3.
That's how it gets the money. It takes the loan. That's how it gets the money to invest in the stock.
Okay.
It only works by borrowing money, investing in the company, taking the earnings of its share of the company earnings, repaying the lender, and when it's paid full and clear, then earning. Now you could think of this in another way. Just forget about the company. Let's suppose that there was an apartment building in New York with 6 units in an area where you expect the neighborhood to go up in value. You could get a loan at 100% of the company at the value of the real estate. Buy the building, let the rents pay for the building, and after the rents are paid for the building, just like a mortgage, then own free and clear begins earning an income for the new owners. I mean, that is to say, this could apply on a residential basis, but real estate is a risky investment, and we're talking about a binary investment that really looks to America's major companies.
Now, why isn't the stock market doing this? I always thought when you buy stock, aren't you sort of buying a piece of the action?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple of reasons why you do. First of all, if you do not own capital today, you are acquiring capital with the earnings of labor, not with the earnings of capital.
I see. Okay.
Most people cannot
not
have, through their labor and welfare income, discretionary income to acquire stock.
Right. Okay. I got it.
That's one element to it. Second element, and this gets clear when you get to the third picture, most companies retain earnings on their stock.
Yes.
Which means that people without capital cannot get the credit to acquire the capital because the capital they're acquiring doesn't throw off enough income to repay loans in a competitive period.
Right.
And then there's a third element that relates to monetary policy, and that's something we need to get into. But that's how, either with that 3-box diagram, that's how companies could expand their ownership. And it's also the same principle would work if you could imagine the company being a building and the trust being a trust for new owners of the building and the lender being that. It's the same principle. Capital buys itself on the promise of its future income, and after it's paid for itself, generates an income beyond the cost of the recovery cost of the capital.
How would you go about explaining this to a guy who, say, owns a plastics factory? How would you explain to him that his workers could become, a part owners, by acquiring capital without scaring the living daylights out of him?
I don't know. First of all, there are probably in this country about 10 million ESOPs today, percentages that also work with profit-sharing plans and pension plans, these can be attractive to some existing owners. First of all, there are some owners that believe that if you capitalize your employees, they'll work more productively for the company. And there is a movement to broaden ownership with ESOPs. Sometimes an owner will be close to retirement, and if he can't get a good enough deal by selling his company to some outside buyer, may end up selling it to his employees. Partly because maybe they think they can get a better price, partly for idealistic reasons. There are ESOPs.
Say, Robert, stay tuned. We've got to postpone this for the last chapter. Can you hold on for one more show?
Yes.
Okay, because we really need to cover it up. Wrap this up now, and stay tuned for the third part because we're going to go over how it's done.
Okay.
So thank you, and this is Paula Gloria. This is Farther Down the Rabbit Hole, and we're now on the final episode to explain how we can make binary economics actually happen, as Aaron was saying, without scaring the heck out of people who own assets and are concerned about losing something in order to empower the masses. And we have with us Professor Robert Ashford, who is a professor of law at Syracuse, and also Aaron, who's known on YouTube as Blastingcaps. So I'm sorry we couldn't finish it in the last episode. Do you want to pick up from where we left off?
Happy to do it.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, well, Aaron's asked an excellent question. How do you explain this to people without scaring? First of all,
the daylight.
I have to, again, take my hat off to you because you ask all the great questions, and you're really tracking, and that's just a joy to my heart. Let me say to you that stepping back for a minute, one of the reasons why binary economics is not discussed is that if you look sort of psychosociologically at capitalist systems, ownership is one of the great taboos. Ownership is not something that is generally talked about. And for an owner to be confronted with the idea of sharing ownership, it's almost not polite to do it.
Yes.
And it's almost like they have to open up the
Right.
subject. Ownership is not commonly thought of as an issue. For example, if you were to ask why are people poor and look at all the funding that's done for why people are poor, and if you look at the studies done at universities, and if you look at all the, people, of course, they don't work hard enough, they don't work smart enough, people, or because capitalists are greedy, or because technology is taking jobs outside here, or there's 1,000 different reasons. Nobody says people are people because they don't own enough.
Right.
You won't typically find that as
Right.
a solution or as an issue. Yet it's obviously the most elegant issue. The difference between the rich and the poor, the most consistent difference between the rich and the poor, is not education, is not hard work, is not race. Is not the most consistent thing. Is that the difference between the rich and the poor is the rich own and the poor don't. That is statistically the one-to-one correspondence almost between. Yet it's not talked about.
But Robert, I feel with binary economics, it's not that zero-sum game that if I own less, or if I own less, that's the only way for the other to own more.
Oh, but the perception is.
That's the perception.
You see, because going back to something two programs ago, if the promise of the broader ownership in the future will not produce growth in the present, which is the binary principle that Adam Smith, Karl Marx, and John Maynard Keynes didn't see, if broader ownership in the future will not produce growth in the present, a corollary of that is that broader ownership in the future will take away ownership of those who have. Those two things are inescapably mathematically connected. It is only...
No, let me recap to make this really solid. In other words, if you don't take into account that as time goes on and capital becomes more productive, then if you don't allow capital to be in the hands of the many, they will not have the capacity to buy the things that you need in the future, because labor becomes more and more an insignificant aspect of the wealth that they need to buy the future products.
Yes, and if there's no growth in the future, then broadening ownership amounts to taking from the rich. true. Then broader ownership does not amount to taking in the rich. That's right.
Do you follow that, Aaron?
Yes. Yeah.
Can you recapitulate it just so everybody gets it, how you're seeing it?
Well, I'm kind of I'm thinking here, and I don't know if this is exactly the same way, but I was sitting here thinking that economically speaking, we're still listening to guys, like you said, Adam Smith had already even seen a machine. We seem to have constructed our economic lives around ideas that it's almost like we're driving a Model T Ford when we're capable of building Ferraris.
That's right. That's exactly true. We are pretending that when you load sacks on a donkey, we are doing more work.
Right.
And there's a fundamental dishonesty and lack of reality to that. We're pretending that as we shift more and more work from labor to capital, you can solve the income problem through jobs and welfare, and you can't.
And you know what? It seems as though by not looking at that fundamental dishonesty is going to come back and bite even people at the top, because the whole thing is going to run down.
Well, that I'm not sure of. I mean, it's possible. They're the sort of the catastrophe people. But remember, when you own all the apple trees, you can always and your object is to grow slow. The monopolist wants to grow slow so he or she can acquire it all, than to grow fast if it means cutting other people in. That's the cynical monopolist point of view. So remember, there's a lot of power that they have to be able to. I mean, if people start getting hungry and demonstrating and storming the Bastille, you can always make some more apples. I mean, so I'm not convinced that the catastrophe theory is going to shake things loose.
Yes, but what about this? How about the weaponry that we don't even know about? You see, the sites that are getting taken down off YouTube have to do with advanced weaponry, and guess what, Robert? Since last week when I spoke to you, do you know what kind of sites are being taken down? Very straight sites that have to do with the markets. These older guys, there's no pornography, there's no copyright. They're just talking about what's going on in the stock market. These sites are being taken down.
Well, all of
so
that
that's a catastrophe.
I'm not qualified to.
I understand
About those processes of change. I am. What I think I can offer is